Today, I want to start with a mystery. Not a big Hollywood mystery, no murder weapon, no detective, no dramatic courtroom reveal. Just one question. Because, according to reporting from WITF in Harrisburg, the Republican candidate for governor in Pennsylvania, Stacy Garrity, says that before Donald Trump endorsed her, he asked her one question. She answered it. He endorsed her. And when reporters asked what the question was, she wouldn't tell them. Now, if you're a journalist, that's the kind of answer that makes you ask the question again and again and again. And every time, Garrity confirmed the same thing. Yes, Trump asked a question. Yes, she answered it. No, she's not telling us what it was. So now we're left with a mystery. Apparently, there is a question you have to answer correctly if you want Donald Trump's endorsement for governor. But voters aren't allowed to know what that question is. And if you're wondering why that matters, well, welcome to Pennsylvania politics. Hello, everyone. You are listening to Your Neighbor on the Left, the podcast where we talk about progressive politics, human decency, and life on the blue side of America's ideological divide. My name is Don Spielis, and I am your host. And today we're going to be talking about a whole slew of interesting things. We're going to take a look at the concept of national security and whether or not it's being used dishonestly. We're going to take a look at how procedural chaos is used as a tool, particularly in Congress these days, and we're going to talk about why political arguments always seem so exhausting, not to mention pointless these days. But our main topic for this week is Stacy Garrity, the GOP candidate for Pennsylvania governor. Ms. Garrity has the dubious distinction of having gotten Donald Trump's endorsement, which is no small deal. However, there is something she's refusing to tell voters about that endorsement, and we're going to delve into that. But first, those hot topics. Let me start with two words that sound incredibly serious. Two words that immediately make people sit up a little straighter and lower their voices just a bit. Those words are national security. Now, to be clear, national security is obviously a real thing. Countries do need to protect themselves. Governments do need intelligence agencies. They exist for a reason. Nobody is suggesting we just leave the doors unlocked and just hope for the best. But here's the thing that doesn't get talked about nearly enough. In Washington, the phrase national security doesn't just describe threats to the country. Very often, it functions as something different entirely. It functions as a conversation stopper. And once you start noticing this, it's hard to unsee it. You'll hear a politician questioned about a decision, maybe a military strike, maybe surveillance, maybe intelligence operations, and the response goes something like this. I can't go into details because of national security. And just like that, the discussion ends. The reporter just nods, the press conference moves on to the next topic, and the public is left with the political equivalent of, because I said so. Now, again, sometimes that's legitimate. There really are situations where revealing details would compromise intelligence sources or military operations. If an undercover spy is operating in a hostile country, let's say, you probably shouldn't announce his name at a press conference. That kind of stuff is not controversial. But here's where things get tricky. The term national security is incredibly broad. It could include military defense, intelligence operations, cybersecurity, border policy, economic issues, and even things like infrastructure or the protection of it. In other words, if a government official wants to classify something under the umbrella of national security, that umbrella is pretty big. And because it's so broad, it becomes politically useful. If something is framed as a national security issue, three things happen immediately. First, the situation suddenly feels urgent. Second, the assumption becomes that secrecy is necessary. And third, and this is the big one, debate is shut down. Because if you question something labeled national security, then the implication, subtle or not so subtle, is that you might be undermining the safety of the country. And that's a pretty powerful move. Now, let's talk about the secrecy part of this, because that's where the real tension always comes in. The United States has intelligence agencies whose entire job is to gather secret information. Agencies like the Central Intelligence Agency and the National Security Agency, they operate largely outside of the public eye. They collect intelligence, they analyze threats, they monitor communications, they run covert operations, and in many cases, the details of what they are doing are classified and stay classified for decades. Again, that secrecy sometimes makes absolute sense. Intelligence gathering isn't exactly something you want to live stream on Facebook. But the problem is that democracy depends on public accountability. Citizens are supposed to be able to evaluate the decisions that their leaders are making, and that becomes extremely difficult when the justification for those decisions relies on information that the public can't see. So you hear phrases like, "We have intelligence we cannot disclose." And the translation of that is, "Just trust us." Now, sometimes that trust is warranted, but history tells us that sometimes it really, really isn't. A classic example comes from the run-up to the Iraq War back in the early 2000s. The administration of George W. Bush argued that Iraq possessed weapons of mass destruction and posed an urgent national security threat. Those claims were repeated constantly. If you're not old enough to remember, you can trust me on this one. It was wall to wall. The situation was framed as dangerous and time sensitive. And as we all know now, those weapons of mass destruction never materialized. Investigations later showed that the intelligence was deeply flawed, misinterpreted in some cases, and in other cases, just intentionally exaggerated. But by the time that became clear, the war had already begun. Now, this isn't about relitigating that war 20 years later. The point is something broader. When national security claims rely on secret intelligence, the public has no way to independently evaluate them in real time. You're essentially being asked to make a decision without seeing any evidence. And that dynamic shows up in other areas too. Take surveillance laws that expanded dramatically after the attacks of September 11th. Congress passed sweeping legislation granting intelligence agencies much broader authority to monitor communications and track potential threats. Those laws were justified in the name of national security. And again, some of those tools were undoubtedly necessary. But many lawmakers later admitted they had very little time to review the full scope of the legislation before they had to vote on it, which means Congress was effectively asked to approve major expansions of government surveillance under intense pressure and limited information. Now, fast forward to today. When officials discuss military actions or intelligence operations, the same pattern often appears. Leaders, including Donald Trump, and defense figures like Pete Hegseth frequently frame decisions in terms of national security while providing only limited details. That doesn't automatically mean those decisions are wrong, but it does mean the public often has to evaluate them without access to the full picture. And that brings us to another important piece of the puzzle, the media. A lot of people imagine reporters aggressively interrogating government officials until they reveal the truth. And sometimes that does indeed happen, but national security issues create a unique challenge for journalists. If a reporter presses too hard for details, the official response is something like, "That information is classified," or "Discussing that publicly would compromise national security." And once those words come out of someone's mouth, the room gets awkward real fast. Because if a journalist continues pushing, they risk being accused of endangering the country. Nobody wants to be the reporter blamed for revealing sensitive intelligence. So even major outlets like the New York Times or CNN sometimes hit a wall when the conversation turns to classified matters. The result is that a lot of national security reporting relies on anonymous sources, partial leaks, and incomplete information, which is not exactly a recipe for crystal clear public understanding. And then there's Congress. In theory, Congress is supposed to provide oversight of national security decisions. Members receive classified briefings. They review intelligence assessments. They have committees dedicated to monitoring intelligence agencies and military operations and the works. In practice, that oversight can be uneven. Part of the problem is political risk. If a member of Congress publicly challenges a national security claim and later something goes wrong, say a terrorist attack or a military escalation or whatever, that politician could be blamed or pictured or set up as soft on security. And in American politics, being labeled as soft on security is about as appealing as volunteering to referee a bar fight. So many lawmakers choose to go the safer route, defer to the executive branch, which means presidents often gain expanded power during national security crises. And here's where the incentives become obvious. If you're a politician trying to push through a controversial decision, framing it as national security issues has distinct advantages. It creates urgency, it discourages criticism from any direction, and it suggests that dissent might be irresponsible. In other words, it's very politically convenient. Now, let's be clear about something. None of this means national security threats aren't real. They absolutely are, positively. The world is a complicated place and often very dangerous. But recognizing that reality doesn't mean citizens should stop asking questions. In fact, national security decisions are often the most important decisions governments ever make. They involve things like war and surveillance, civil liberties, and enormous amounts of taxpayer money. Those are precisely the kinds of decisions that deserve to get scrutiny. The challenge is finding the balance between legitimate secrecy and democratic accountability. Because if everything can just be justified under the banner of national security, then the phrase stops being a description of genuine threats and starts becoming a political shield. And once that happens, the public is no longer evaluating policy. They're simply being asked to trust authority. Now, maybe sometimes that trust is deserved, but history suggests that blind trust is rarely a winning strategy. So the next time you hear a politician say something is necessary for national security, it's worth asking a few basic questions. What evidence exists? What oversight is happening anywhere? And who, if anyone, benefits from the secrecy? Because those two words, national security, can protect the country. But they can also protect politicians. They can protect them from questions. And in a democracy, questions are kind of the whole point. We've all heard politicians say things like, "We're fighting for the American people." or we're standing up for democracy. But sometimes, the real strategy isn't persuasion, and it's not compromise either. Sometimes the strategy is something else entirely. Create so much procedural chaos that the system stops working. Flood the courts, stall Congress, trigger investigations, file motions, raise objections, repeat until everyone watching at home throws up their hands and says, you know what, government just doesn't work. And when people start believing that, well, some politicians actually consider that a win. Let's start with something simple. Most of us were taught that politics works like a debate. Two sides argue their case, someone wins, someone loses, and eventually the system moves forward. That's the story we were all told in civics class. But modern politics doesn't always work like debate club. Increasingly, it works more like a traffic jam. Imagine trying to drive through an intersection where every car is honking, nobody follows the lights, someone's blocking the lane, and three people are arguing about who has the right of way. The result isn't persuasion, it's paralysis. There's a growing strategy in politics that thrives on exactly that kind of chaos. Instead of winning arguments, the goal is to overwhelm the system with procedures, rules, motions, objections, lawsuits, investigations, whatever, until nothing meaningful actually happens. Think of democracy as a machine. It has gears, legislatures, courts, agencies, elections. When everything works normally, the gears turn and the system moves forward. Procedural chaos is like throwing sand into those gears. Not smashing the machine, just slowing it down to where it barely works. Now, when I say procedural chaos, I'm talking about something pretty specific. Political systems run on procedures, rules about how things get done. Congress has procedures for voting. Courts have procedures for lawsuits. Agencies have procedures for their regulations. Those rules exist for a good reason. They protect fairness. They protect minority rights. They slow things down so that power can't be abused easily. But here's the twist. Those same rules can be weaponized. Instead of using procedures to ensure fairness, politicians can use them to create noise and delay and confusion and gridlock. It's a little like the internet version of a denial of service attack. In cybersecurity, you don't always hack the server. Sometimes you just flood it with so many requests that it stops functioning. Procedural chaos it does the same thing to these institutions. Flood the courts with lawsuits. Flood Congress with objections. Flood agencies with investigations. Eventually, the system just becomes overwhelmed. And when people at home look at that mess, they don't see a clever procedural tactic. They just see dysfunction. They see a government that appears incapable of doing anything. One place where procedural chaos shows up a lot is Congress. Congress has an enormous number of rules. They're designed to protect debate and minority rights. And historically, those rules mattered. They were meant to prevent the majority from steamrolling everyone else. But in recent decades, some politicians have figured out that those same rules can be used to grind the entire legislative process to a halt. A senator can demand votes on endless amendments. They can call procedural votes. They can stall proceedings with motions and objections. Sometimes it's done to highlight an issue. Sometimes it's just done purely for political theater. One famous example involved Ted Cruz, who in 2013 launched a marathon Senate speech protesting the Affordable Care Act. During that speech, Cruz read Green Eggs and Ham on the Senate floor. Yes, the Dr. Seuss book. Now, to be clear, that speech didn't actually stop the Affordable Care Act. The law remained in place. But the goal wasn't necessarily to stop the law. The goal was to be a spectacle. Delay, pressure, add chaos. And it worked in one important way. It turned a procedural maneuver into a national political event. Procedural chaos isn't limited to Congress, however. The courts can be used the same way. The American legal system allows people to challenge decisions in court. That's an important protection in a democracy. But courts can also be overwhelmed. You've probably seen examples of this in election disputes. After the 2020 presidential election, Donald Trump and his allies filed dozens of lawsuits challenging the results in multiple states. Most of those cases were dismissed by judges for lack of evidence. But here's the important part. Even when the lawsuit fails, they can still serve a political purpose. They can delay certification deadlines. They can generate news headlines. They can create the impression that something suspicious must be happening, which I believe was the intent of those lawsuits in that particular case. But at any rate, in other words, the legal system becomes part of the noise machine because of the way it's structured. Another place procedural chaos shows up is inside the bureaucracy. Government agencies run on rules. Investigations, regulations, compliance reviews, all of that is procedural by design. But those procedures can also be turned into weapons. Suddenly, agencies are juggling multiple investigations. They're responding to subpoenas. They're navigating conflicting orders from different political authorities. Instead of doing their normal work, civil servants spend time responding to the chaos. And once again, the public sees the outcome and draws a simple conclusion. Government is broken. Now, you might be asking, if this strategy creates so much dysfunction, why do politicians keep doing it? Well, because politically, chaos can be useful. For those of you who are Game of Thrones fans, you might remember Littlefinger saying, "Chaos is a ladder." Most voters aren't following procedural details. They don't track Senate motions or court filings. They see headlines. They see arguments on television. They see constant conflict. And eventually, many people reach a familiar conclusion that government just doesn't work. For politicians who campaign on the idea that government is incompetent or corrupt or illegitimate or whatever, that perception actually helps them. The dysfunction becomes proof of their narrative. Now, add social media to this mix and things get even messier. Platforms reward outrage and speed. Nuance doesn't travel very well online. A complicated procedural dispute can turn into a viral talking point in minutes. Bots amplify it, influencers react to it, partisan accounts spread the most dramatic version of the story. And by the time the actual facts emerge, millions of people already have seen the chaotic version. Procedural disputes become political entertainment, and entertainment spreads way faster than explanation. The real danger of political chaos isn't that it slows down one bill or one court case or whatever. The danger is what it does to our view of government, our trust in government. Democracy depends on something that's easy to overlook: good faith. People have to believe that the rules exist to make the system work, not to sabotage it. When procedures become weapons, the gears of democracy don't break instantly. They just grind slowly and loudly until people start asking a very dangerous question. Is the system even capable of working anymore? Most democratic systems don't collapse because someone storms in and smashes them with a hammer. Most often, they erode slowly. One delay at a time, one lawsuit at a time, one procedural maneuver at a time. It's not dramatic. It's not cinematic. It's just sand in the gears. And if enough sand gets thrown in, eventually the machine stops moving. I think most of us at one point or another, especially these days, have had a political argument. So I'll ask you this question. Have you ever spent 20 minutes laying out a careful argument for someone? You cite your sources, you explain the facts, you walk through the logic step by step, and the other person listens and nods and then says something like, "Yeah, I just don't buy it." And then they move on to the next claim. And you're sitting there thinking, "Did you hear anything I just said?" If that experience feels familiar, you're not imagining things. And more importantly, you're not necessarily bad at arguing. What you're running into is something researchers and philosophers have been studying for years. In fact, two concepts together explain a huge amount of what's happening in modern political arguments. The first concept is indoctrination, and the second is something called Brandolini's Law, also known as the BS asymmetry principle. When you put those two ideas together, suddenly a lot of today's political discourse starts to suddenly make sense. So let's start with indoctrination. Most people think indoctrination simply means teaching someone something that's false. But philosophers who study how beliefs work in society say that's not actually the defining feature. The key feature of indoctrination isn't what someone believes, it's how the belief is protected. Philosopher Chris Rinaldi has written about the idea of the field of social epistemology, which is basically the study of how people form beliefs inside communities and social systems. Rinaldi's argument is that indoctrination happens when a belief becomes sealed off from counter evidence. In other words, the belief system builds its own walls of defense. So when someone presents new information or contradicting evidence, the response isn't curiosity. It's not reconsideration. Instead, the belief system has already prepared a response in advance. You'll hear things like, "That source is fake," or "The media is lying," "That's propaganda," "You're being manipulated." The counter-argument hasn't even been evaluated. It's dismissed automatically. And that's why indoctrination can feel so frustrating when you encounter it. The person you're talking to may actually be intelligent and thoughtful in many areas of life, but when it comes to certain beliefs, their mental system has been trained to treat doubt as dangerous. In that sense, indoctrination creates something like a psychological fortress. Information that supports the belief is welcomed within the walls. Information that challenges it is rejected at the gate. Now, here's where the second concept comes in. Even if someone is open to hearing evidence, there's another structural problem in modern political arguments, and this one has a surprisingly simple name. It's called Brandolini's Law, named after the Italian programmer Alberto Brandolini. Brandolini's Law says this: the amount of energy required to refute nonsense is an order of magnitude greater than the energy required to produce it. So, in plain English, it takes 10 seconds to make a false claim, but it might take 10 minutes to explain why that claim is false. Think about it this way. Someone might say, "The Great Wall of China is the only man-made structure visible from space." That's one sentence. Correcting that myth requires explaining what astronauts actually report seeing from orbit, how narrow the wall is, how visibility works at orbital altitude, and why the myth spread in the first place. By the time you finish explaining all of that, the person who made the claim has already moved on to something else. This is why misinformation spreads so easily. False claims are short and simple. Corrections, on the other hand, require nuance and evidence and explanation. A lie can travel halfway around the internet before the truth has even finished tying its shoes. Now, put these two things together. On one side, you have indoctrination, belief systems that automatically reject counter evidence. And on the other side, you have Brandolini's Law, the reality that explaining the truth takes so much more time and effort than spreading misinformation. When those two forces collide, you get something many of us experience all the time these days: argument exhaustion. One person throws out a rapid series of claims, memes, slogans, whatever. The other person tries to respond carefully with facts and context and evidence, but the pace of the conversation is completely uneven. The misinformation side can produce claims faster than the truth side can dismantle them. And if the listener has already been trained to distrust mainstream information sources, then even the careful explanation probably isn't going to land. This is one reason political arguments online can feel like you're running on a treadmill. You're constantly responding, constantly correcting, constantly explaining. And yet, nothing seems to change. The problem isn't always the quality of the argument. The problem is that the structure of the conversation itself is tilted. You're trying to have a thoughtful discussion in a system that rewards speed and simplicity and emotional reaction. Another thing that's important to understand here is that indoctrination doesn't necessarily mean that the person is stupid. In fact, many indoctrinated people are perfectly capable of complex reasoning. Absolutely, 100%. But that reasoning ability often gets used in a very specific way: defending the belief system. Psychologists sometimes call this motivated reasoning. Instead of asking, "Is this true?" the brain says, "How can I defend what I already believe?" And once that pattern becomes ingrained, arguments rarely change minds. That doesn't mean conversations are pointless, but it does mean we should rethink what success looks like. Philosophers like Ranalli suggest that confronting indoctrination directly, attacking the belief head-on, often backfires. If the belief system treats criticism as enemy propaganda, then criticism simply reinforces the defensive walls. Instead, change tends to happen when people are given an off-ramp, so to speak. A moment where questioning belief feels socially and emotionally safe. Because doubt, of course, can be scary, especially if a person's whole identity or community or worldview is built around certain ideas. Understanding these dynamics doesn't magically fix political polarization, but it can at least explain why so many conversations today feel absolutely exhausting. It's not simply that people disagree. It's that we're often operating under completely different rules for how truth and evidence are evaluated. So the next time you find yourself in one of those endless political arguments, the kind where you're carefully explaining facts and the other person just keeps tossing out new claims, try to remember this: you're not necessarily losing the argument. You may just be running into the combined effects of indoctrination and Brandolini's Law. And in that environment, the exhaustion you feel is not a personal failure. It's a structural feature of the conversation. So now on to our main topic for the week. Stacy Garrity, the GOP candidate for the governor of Pennsylvania, has gotten Donald Trump's endorsement, and there are some questions surrounding that. So let's start with the basics, because unless you follow Pennsylvania politics closely, there's a good chance you've never heard of Stacy Garrity, at least not until fairly recently. She is the current state treasurer for Pennsylvania, a statewide office that most voters honestly don't think about very much unless something goes wrong with the state's finances. Treasurers manage State investments oversee programs like unclaimed property and generally act as financial stewards for the state government. It's an important job, but it's not usually a job that makes you a political celebrity. That changed when Garrity decided to run for governor. And then it changed again when she secured the endorsement of Donald Trump. In modern Republican politics, that endorsement is not a small thing. It can be the difference between winning a primary comfortably and getting dragged through months of internal party warfare. Trump's backing signals to Republican voters, this is the candidate I want. And that matters enormously in the primaries. But before we talk about why Trump endorsed Garrity, it's worth understanding who she actually is. Before entering politics, Garrity had a long career in the military. She served more than 3 decades in the U.S. Army Reserve and eventually retired as a colonel. She was deployed in Iraq and received a Bronze Star for her service. After her military career, she transitioned into the private sector. She worked in banking and business leadership roles. That resume, military service, business experience, then politics, is a fairly classic American political trajectory. But resume alone doesn't tell you where a politician fits ideologically. For that, you have to look at how they position themselves politically, and Garrity's positioning has been very clear. She is firmly aligned with the political movement built around Trump. At one point, she described Trump as, quote, the greatest president of my lifetime. Now, think about that statement and think about what it implies. That sentence skips over Reagan and both Bush presidencies and Clinton and Barack Obama and the whole list, and lands squarely on what we've got now, which tells you a lot about where she sits within today's Republican Party. Now let's get back to that strange little political mystery that I teased before. The story comes from reporting by WITF, the public media outlet based in Harrisburg. Garrity said that when Trump was considering endorsing her, he asked her one specific question. She answered that question, and then he gave her his endorsement. But when the reporters then asked what the question was, she declined to say, repeatedly. And this is where the political intrigue begins. Because in politics, when someone refuses to answer a question that persistently, it usually means one of two things. Either the answer is embarrassing, or the answer reveals something about how the political process actually works. I mean, think about it. We all know politicians lie, but how often do you ever have a politician who just outright refuses to answer a question? Listen, the absolute last thing that Pennsylvania needs right now is a Trump acolyte in the governor's mansion. And when we're talking about one that is already in secret mode on his behalf or based on a conversation with him, well, we need that even less. Now, to understand why Trump's endorsement matters so much, you need to understand something about the internal dynamics of the Republican Party in Pennsylvania. Because the party isn't one unified ideological bloc. Instead, it's made up of several overlapping factions. There's the traditional conservative wing focused on business issues and taxes and, the standard Republican priorities as most people understand them. Then there's the Trump-aligned populist wing, which emphasizes nationalism and immigration crackdowns and culture war politics. And then there's a third faction, one that's even more hard line. That faction is represented by figures like Doug Mastriano. Now, if that name sounds familiar, it should. Mastriano was the Republican nominee for governor in 2022, and his campaign became one of the most controversial statewide campaigns that Pennsylvania has seen in decades. Mastriano leaned heavily into election conspiracy theories. He framed politics in overtly religious terms, and he ran a campaign designed almost entirely around energizing the most committed conservative activists. And the result? He lost the general election to Josh Shapiro by about 15 points, which is a landslide in modern day statistics. And it triggered a serious argument inside the Republican Party. Was Mastriano too extreme to win statewide? Or did he simply, run a bad campaign? And that debate is still shaping Republican politics in Pennsylvania today. This is where Garrity enters the story. She is clearly aligned with Trump and MAGA politics, but she is generally seen as more electable and less polarizing than dudes like Mastriano, which makes her an appealing candidate for Republicans who want a Trump-aligned governor, but don't want a repeat of the beating Mastriano took in 2022. Trump's endorsement helps lock that positioning in place because when Trump endorses someone early, it discourages other MAGA candidates from jumping into the race and trying to claim that movement's support. In other words, Trump's endorsement doesn't just support Garrity, it clears the field for her, so to speak. From the perspective of a Pennsylvania progressive, I would think that the last thing any one of us should vote for is the person Trump likes the most. I mean, for God's sake, look at his cabinet. It's filled with his favorites. And what does that look like? How are those choices working out? But let's talk about policy issues. On abortion, Garrity has described herself as 100% pro-life. That typically aligns with Republican efforts to restrict abortion access through state legislation. On transgender participation in sports, Garrity has supported policies preventing trans athletes from competing in girl sports at all. Her argument is that athletic competition should be separated strictly by biological sex. On immigration, her positions generally echo whatever comes out of Trump's mouth, emphasizing stronger border enforcement and opposition to policies that are viewed as too lenient towards undocumented immigrants. As far as fiscal issues go, her messaging is fairly standard Republican politics. As treasurer, she frequently talks about protecting taxpayer dollars, reducing government waste, and promoting business-friendly economic policies. So on policy, Garrity's positions are not unusual within today's Republican Party. Where things become more controversial is the topic that still divides American politics more than anything else, and that's the 2020 election. After the 2020 election, Garrity supported efforts to investigate the results in Pennsylvania. She argued that voters deserve transparency and answers about election procedures, particularly regarding mail-in ballots. Now, so far, none of that is too bad. Critics of those efforts point out that numerous court challenges were rejected and that investigations did not uncover widespread voter fraud. But supporters argue that questioning election procedures helps maintain public trust. This disagreement has become one of the defining political divides in American politics, and it remains a major factor in Republican Party politics. Garrity went on record as believing that there was large amounts of fraud in the 2020 election, despite all information to the contrary. And it's worth mentioning here, we are currently dealing with the largest threat to the free election process that the U.S. has seen since the 1950s, the SAVE Act. Why in the world would we want an election denier as the governor of Pennsylvania? There was also a smaller controversy involving Garrity's military record during her 2020 campaign. The critics accused her campaign of implying that her Bronze Star Medal was awarded specifically for combat valor. the Bronze Star can actually be rewarded in one of two ways: for valor in combat or for meritorious service in a combat zone. Garrity's medal was awarded for meritorious service. Her campaign denied that they intentionally misrepresented the award and said that the criticism was politically motivated. The controversy faded fairly quickly, but it occasionally resurfaces in political discussions when her record comes up. So let's zoom out for a second, because the story about Stacy Garrity isn't really just about Stacy Garrity. It's about something bigger. It's about how political power works right now inside the Republican Party. In Pennsylvania, just like in much of the country, one endorsement can shape an entire primary. And that endorsement comes, of course, from Donald Trump. When Trump backs a candidate, it sends a signal to the party base. It tells voters who the movement's preferred candidate is. It tells potential challengers that the lane might already be taken. And sometimes it effectively decides the race before the first primary vote is even cast. That's why the story about the mystery question is so interesting, because it suggests something most of us realized a long time ago: that endorsements like this aren't just about resume. They're not just about experience. They're about alignment. They're about loyalty. They're about making sure everyone is reading from the same political script. And they're about who plants the best smooch on the orange behind. Now, maybe the question Trump asked Garrity was completely harmless. Maybe it was something simple. Maybe it was something strategic. Or maybe it was something that reveals a lot about how political loyalty works in the MAGA universe. We don't know, because Garrity won't tell us. But PA voters should be damn curious, because when someone is running to become the governor of Pennsylvania, it's reasonable to wonder what promises or assurances might have been part of the conversation that helped secure one of the most powerful endorsements in American politics. And in the end, that's what elections are supposed to be about. Not secret questions, not loyalty tests, but voters deciding who they trust to lead their state. And that's a conversation Pennsylvania is going to be having for the next several months. Whether we trust candidates who are already refusing to answer questions, or if we're smarter than that. And now for the high note. I feel like I say this every week, but if you spend as much time reading the news as I do, and if you're listening to a podcast like this, I guess you probably do, it could start to feel like the country is just one long argument that never ends. Politics and outrage and culture wars and social media shouting matches, and it's exhausting. But it's nice to realize that every once in a while you can come across something that reminds you that a lot of Americans are still quietly doing good things for each other. Not loudly, just because they think it matters. One of the best examples of that is something called Little Free Library. If you've never seen one, you probably will soon. They're those little wooden boxes on posts in people's yards or on street corners, basically tiny neighborhood libraries. You open the door, you take a book if you want one, and leave a book if you have one to share. That's it. No membership card, no late fees, no bureaucracy. Just neighbors sharing books with each other. The whole movement started in Wisconsin in 2009 by a guy named Todd Bowl. He built a small wooden box, filled it with books as a tribute to his mother, who had been a teacher and loved reading. He stuck it out in his yard so that people could take a book when they wanted one. And people did. Then other people started building their own little book boxes. Then entire neighborhoods started doing it. Today, there are more than 150,000 little free libraries across the world. Tens of thousands of them here in the United States alone. And when you think about it, there's something quietly radical about that. Because right now we live in a time where a lot of adults seem to have forgotten just how important reading actually is. We're arguing over books in schools. We're banning books in libraries. Politicians are treating literature like it's some kind of dangerous weapon instead of one of the most powerful tools human beings have ever invented. Meanwhile, regular people are literally building tiny libraries in their front yards. That contrast tells you something. Reading does something to your brain that almost nothing else can replicate. It slows you down. It forces you to think. It lets you step into someone else's life for a while. When you read a novel, you're seeing the world through someone else's eyes. When you read history, you're learning how the world got to where it is today. When you read science, you're understanding how reality actually works. And when you read ideas you don't agree with, which is something social media algorithms really don't encourage anymore, you develop something that's in very short supply these days: perspective. Reading builds empathy. It builds curiosity. It builds critical thinking. And those three things are basically the immune system of a healthy democracy. A population that reads is much harder to manipulate. A population that reads is much more likely to ask questions. And a population that reads tends to recognize when someone is trying to sell them a convenient lie. Now here's the ironic part. For all the political fights over books right now, Americans are still quietly showing that they value reading. A lot of little free libraries have actually become places where people share books that are being challenged or banned in schools. You will see copies of novels, biographies, history books, even kids' books that someone thought shouldn't be available anymore. And instead of disappearing, those books end up in a tiny wooden box in someone's yard. No controversy, no cable news panels, no performative outrage. Just a note inside that says something like, "Take one, share one." It's kind of beautiful when you think about it, because it reminds us that culture isn't just shaped by politicians or school boards or viral posts. It's shaped by regular people doing small things over and over and over again. A parent leaving a book for a kid down the street. A retiree stocking a neighborhood library with mystery novels. A college student dropping off books that made them think differently about the world. These are tiny actions, but tiny actions scale. One box becomes 10, and 10 becomes 100, and 100 becomes thousands. And before you know it, you have a quiet nationwide network of neighbors encouraging each other to read. No advertising campaign, no federal program, no political movement, just people who still believe books matter. And maybe that's the hopeful part, because if you spend too much time online, it can feel like the loudest voices in America are the ones who want to shut things down. Shut down conversations, shut down ideas, shut down curiosity. But out in the world, the real world, there are people doing the exact opposite. They're opening little doors. Literally. They're putting books inside. And they're trusting that somebody walking by might pick one up and discover something new. Maybe a new idea, maybe a new perspective, maybe even a new way of seeing the world. And if there's one thing history has taught us, it's that societies that keep reading tend to keep thinking. And societies that keep thinking tend to stay free. So the next time you see one of those little wooden boxes on a street corner, take a second to stop and look inside. You might find a novel, you might find a history book, you might find a children's story someone left for the next kid who walks by. But what you're really looking at is something bigger. It's a reminder that knowledge still spreads the same way it always has. One reader at a time. All right, everyone. Thank you so much for taking time to listen to this episode of Your Neighbor on the Left. I want to hear from you. I want feedback, whether it's critique or comment or compliment or whatever. If you go to the website, www.neighborontheleft.com, you can find a contacts page with all the social media links and the email address, any of which you can use to reach out to the podcast. You can also find a page with a web player where you can listen to any episode of the podcast all the way back to the beginning or download them. And there is a blog feature where I'm posting posts that mirror the topics that I talk about in the podcast, including the sources that I use. I will be back on Friday with another installment of Back Porch Files. So between now and then, stay engaged, stay kind, and have the kind of week you'd wish for others.